My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and this is the part of my life I once tried to forget. 3 days before my daughter-in-law's birthday, my son told me I would no longer be involved. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse me of anything. He simply stood in my hallway beside the coat rack and spoke as if he were adjusting a calendar appointment. "Mom, we've decided it's better this way." Daniel said. Better. Marissa stood slightly behind him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She gave me a small, polite smile, the kind you give a neighbor you barely know. Her purse was still on her shoulder, as if she had no intention of staying long. "Welcome to Auntie Rose," narrates before today's story of betrayal and self-discovery. Please subscribe and hit like to help these stories be heard. Drop your sit your country in the comments. It always warms my heart. Now, let's begin. I noticed the empty chair at the kitchen table behind them. I had set it out automatically when they arrived. 3 cups of tea, 3 plates of sliced cake. The chair looked almost embarrassed now, pushed back too far, unused. "We're restructuring things," Marissa added gently. "Financially and personally. It's just healthier." Healthier. I remember nodding, though I did not fully understand what illness I had been carrying. Daniel cleared his throat. "We won't need you to handle any of the transfers anymore, or the bills, or the account access." There it was, clean, quiet, final. For years, I had managed the accounts he struggled to organize. After his father died, I had kept everything steady. When Daniel married, I added Marissa's name because he asked me to. I made sure their rent was paid when his business was slow. I covered small gaps they never spoke about directly. I never called it help. I called it family. "We'll handle it ourselves now," Daniel said. He still wasn't looking at me. On the hallway table near the door lay a small brass house key, the spare I had given them when they first moved into their apartment. "In case you ever need to come by," I had said back then. They had insisted I keep a copy of theirs too. Now Daniel picked up that key from the table and placed it into my hand. "You won't need this anymore," he said softly. The metal felt colder than it should have. No one accused me of wrongdoing. No one said I had failed. There was no argument, no slammed doors, only calm efficiency. Like closing an account. If you have ever felt invisible, you already understand this. I stood there holding that key while they explained new boundaries. Marissa spoke about independence, about building their own future, about healthy distance. She used words that sounded reasonable, thoughtful, mature. Agreed with everything she said. What I did not say was that distance had never been the problem. Absence had. Daniel finally looked at me, but only briefly. "We just want to start this next chapter on our own." Next chapter? I wondered quietly when I had become the previous one. They did not stay for tea. Marissa glanced at her phone and mentioned traffic. Daniel kissed my cheek, quick and light. "The way you might greet someone at a work function? Don't worry," he said. "This doesn't change anything." But it already had. The door closed gently behind them. Not a slam, not anger, just a careful click. I remained standing in the hallway long after their footsteps faded. The house felt larger than it had that morning. The empty chair in the kitchen seemed to watch me. I walked back to the table and slowly removed the untouched cups. The tea had cooled, a thin layer forming on top. I poured it down the sink. Then I picked up my phone. I opened the banking app and stared at the shared accounts. The numbers looked steady, reliable, built over years of discipline and quiet sacrifice. 3 days before her birthday, he had promised her something expensive. I had overheard it weeks earlier, a gift that required confidence, assurance. I realized, standing there with the cold key in my palm, that my quiet support had become an invisible foundation beneath promises I was no longer allowed. to stand on Dot, so I made an appointment at the bank, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because for the first time, I understood that being needed and being valued are not the same thing. That Tuesday morning, as I turned off my engine and stepped out of my car, the air felt sharp and clean. I carried my purse, the envelope with Daniel's name, and the small brass key dot inside the Royal Bank. The doors opened automatically. For once, something recognized my presence. The unraveling did not begin that night in the hallway. It began long before that, in smaller ways. So small that I told myself I was imagining them. After Daniel married Marissa, Sunday dinners continued at my house for a while. I kept the same routine. Roast chicken, steamed vegetables, the lemon pie Daniel loved as a boy. I set the table the way I always had, with the blue plates and cloth napkins folded neatly beside each fork, but something had shifted. They started arriving later. Not very late, just late enough that the food cooled slightly. Daniel would walk in, already checking his phone. Marissa would smile, compliment the house, and then sit across from me instead of beside him. Their conversations began to circle around plans I had not heard about. "We've been thinking about moving closer to the city," Marissa said once, cutting her chicken carefully. "Oh?" I asked. "Since when?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Just exploring options." Exploring. They discussed neighborhoods, prices, school districts for a future they had not mentioned to me before. I listened quietly, waiting for the moment someone would say, "What do you think, Mom?" It never came. The empty chair beside me seemed to grow heavier each week. Car rides changed too. I used to drive Daniel to appointments when his schedule became crowded. After the wedding, he insisted on driving himself. The one time I offered, he hesitated. "We've got it handled," he said gently. Marissa began accompanying him to meetings with the financial advisor I had known for 20 years. I only learned about it because the advisor called to confirm paperwork. When I asked Daniel why he hadn't mentioned it, he sounded surprised. "Oh, I thought I told you." He had not doubted at first. I believed this was natural. A young couple building their independence. I told myself it was healthy, necessary even, but independence has a different sound than exclusion. Independence sounds like, "We'll try this on our own, but thank you." Exclusion sounds like silence. One evening, I stopped by their apartment with a container of soup. Daniel had been sick the week before. I had not seen him in days. I knocked gently and waited. Through the door, I could hear their voices, low, calm, discussing something serious. The door opened just enough for Marissa to step outside. She did not invite me in. "Oh, Eleanor, you didn't need to come," she said, her voice polite. "I made soup," I replied, holding out the container. She accepted it with both hands, but her body remained angled toward the hallway behind her, guarded. "We're in the middle of something," she added softly from inside. I heard Daniel's voice, but I could not make out the words. "That's fine," I said quickly. "I won't stay." The door closed gently. I stood in the corridor for a moment longer than I should have. The hallway light flickered faintly. Someone upstairs was vacuuming. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. I realized then that I no longer knew what was happening inside my son's world. Conversations grew shorter after that. Daniel began answering calls later in the day, sometimes not at all. When I mentioned an upcoming bill I had transferred money for, he sounded almost uncomfortable. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said. "But I want to," I replied. There was a pause. "Maybe it's better if we manage it ourselves." Manage. The word returned. Soft but firm. At the next Sunday dinner, I noticed something new. Daniel and Marissa exchanged glances before responding to my questions, as if checking for approval. "How's the business?" I asked. "It's good," Daniel said quickly. Marissa added, "We're restructuring some things." Restructuring. The same language. The same careful tone. I felt like a guest at my own table. Later that evening, while washing dishes, I overheard them speaking in the living room. I did not mean to listen. Their voices carried softly down the hallway. "She doesn't need to know everything," Marissa said. "I know," Daniel replied. "I'll handle it." Handle it. I dried my hands slowly and remained in the kitchen until they finished. There were no raised voices. No accusations. Just quiet decisions being made without me. A week later, I discovered they had opened new accounts. Separate ones. I found out not because they told me, but because an automatic transfer I set up failed. When I asked Daniel about it, he sounded distracted. "Oh, right. We moved some things around." "Some things?" I nodded. Even though he could not see me through the phone, it became a pattern. Plans discussed elsewhere. Adjustments made quietly. Invitations extended to others before me. I learned about their vacation from a photo posted online. Daniel and Marissa smiling on a beach I did not recognize. The caption read, "Finally taking time for ourselves." I stared at that sentence longer than I expected. Time for ourselves. Had I been taking their time from them? When Marissa's birthday approached, Daniel mentioned he was planning something special. He spoke about it casually while standing in my kitchen doorway. "I've got it covered," he said, almost proudly. "I want it to be big this year." "That's wonderful," I replied. He did not mention that the gift required money he did not yet have. I had seen the numbers. I always saw the numbers, but this time, no one asked. The final shift happened in the smallest moment. I arrived at their apartment one afternoon after. Daniel texted that he might stop by later in the week. I thought I would surprise them with fresh bread. I still had my copy of their key. I hesitated before unlocking the door. I always knocked first. But that day I used the key. Inside. The apartment looked the same, clean, carefully arranged. But something felt different. On the hallway table beside a stack of unopened mail lay an envelope with my name, written across it. Not Mom. Eleanor. Closed the door behind me quietly and picked up the envelope. Inside was a short letter. It explained that they were setting boundaries. That surprise visits made them uncomfortable. That moving forward, all visits should be scheduled in advance. There was no anger in the words, only distance. I sat down on the edge of their couch and read it twice. I had used that key hundreds of times to drop off groceries, to water plants when they traveled, to leave small notes in the kitchen. Now the key felt like an intrusion. When Daniel returned home and found me there, he did not look angry. He looked tired. "Mom," he said softly, "we were going to talk to you about that." I held up the letter. "You already did." He exhaled slowly. "We just need space." Space. The room felt very full at that moment. Full of unsaid things. Full of careful restraint. I stood up and walked to the hallway table. I removed the small brass key from my purse and placed it beside the envelope. "You won't need to write me next time," I said gently. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were no tears. No dramatic scene. Marissa stepped out of the bedroom and offered me a small nod. Almost grateful, I walked to the door and paused. For years, I had believed love meant staying close, being available, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Now I understood that my presence had become something to manage. Opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Behind me, the door closed with a soft, careful click. That sound did not echo. It settled quietly into my chest. Where belonging used to live, I did not fall apart after I left their apartment that day. I went home, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of my desk beside old insurance papers and instruction manuals. For a few weeks, I moved through my house like a guest. I kept expecting my phone to ring with Daniel's name on the screen. It did not. The silence was not cruel. It was simply consistent. I began taking longer walks in the evenings, passing streets I had driven down for years without noticing. One afternoon, light rain began to fall, and I stepped into a small neighborhood cafe to wait it out. It was not a place I had ever visited before. The windows were wide, the tables plain wood, the air warm with the smell of coffee and toasted bread. I chose a seat near the window and placed my purse on the chair beside me out of habit, saving it for someone who was not coming. After a moment, I moved the purse to the floor. The woman behind the counter brought my tea without asking many questions. "Take your time," she said quietly. Her name tag read Miriam. I nodded and sat there longer than I needed to. Over the next week, I returned. Not because the tea was special, but because no one expected anything from me there. Miriam began setting a small dish of sliced apple beside my cup without mentioning it. "You never finish a full pastry," she said once, almost apologetically. It was a small observation, a small kindness. I did not know how to respond to that kind of attention without obligation attached to it. At first, I remained guarded. When she asked what I used to do for work, I answered briefly. When she asked if I had children, I said one son and left it there. But routine has a quiet way of softening edges. I began arriving at the same time each afternoon. The same corner table, the same tea. The rain against the window became familiar rather than lonely. One day, Miriam slid a folded napkin toward me. On it, she had written, "We're starting a community bookkeeping class on Tuesdays. Thought of you." I stared at the napkin longer than necessary. I had not told her much about my experience with accounts. I must have mentioned it in passing. The idea of sitting in a room with strangers felt uncomfortable. Still, the following Tuesday, I returned. The class was small. 4 people. A young man trying to organize his first business. A single mother wanting to understand her bills. An older gentleman who had recently lost his wife and did not know where she kept the paperwork. I recognized that feeling. Not knowing where things were kept. Not knowing where you stood. I sat at the table and explained simple systems. Envelopes labeled clearly. Calendars marked in pencil. No complicated terms. Just steady guidance. At first, my voice trembled slightly. I had not spoken in front of others in a long time. But as the weeks passed, I felt something steady inside me. No one here was trying to manage my presence. They were simply grateful that I showed up. After class, Miriam would hand me my tea without asking. Once, she placed a small wrapped biscuit beside it. "It's your birthday next week, isn't it?" she said casually. I blinked in surprise. I had mentioned the date only once while filling out a registration form. "Yes," I answered carefully. That morning, I had woken up expecting to feel the familiar weight of disappointment. I had grown used to quiet birthdays, but the following week, when I entered the cafe, there was a single candle and a small slice of cake at my usual table. No singing, no attention drawn, just a soft flame and Miriam wiping down a counter as if nothing unusual had happened. "Make a wish," she said gently. I did not wish for a reconciliation. I did not wish for apologies. I wished for steadiness. I realized then how tired I had been of waiting for someone else to decide my place. The brass key I had once returned to Daniel remained in my coat pocket for weeks after that. I carried it like a question. Sometimes I would reach into my pocket and feel its smooth edge, reminding myself that I had once been trusted with entry. Gradually, the key began to change meaning. It no longer symbolized access to their apartment. It reminded me that I had once built a home strong enough for someone to leave. That strength had not disappeared. One evening after class, the older gentleman lingered. "I finally balanced the account," he said, almost shy. "My wife used to do it. I thought I couldn't." I smiled and told him he had done well. Walking home that night, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not pride exactly, more like alignment. I was not trying to prove my usefulness. I was simply present. Winter came slowly. The cafe windows fogged in the mornings. Miriam began leaving a scarf behind the counter for me when I forgot mine. "You'll catch cold," she would say, half smiling. I protested at first, but eventually I stopped arguing. Accepting care felt unfamiliar. It required admitting that I needed it. One afternoon, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a key. "For the classroom cabinet," she explained. "In case I'm late." I held that key differently than the last one. This one was not being taken from me. It was being given. "Are you sure?" I asked. She nodded. "You're here more consistently than I am." That night, I placed the new key on my kitchen counter and stared at it. The house no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt quiet, yes, but not abandoned. The following weekend, I opened boxes I had never fully unpacked after my husband passed. Old books, framed photographs. I arranged them slowly. For the first time in years, I hung curtains in the spare bedroom instead of leaving it empty for guests who might not come. As I stepped back and looked at the room, the word formed quietly in my mind: home. Not because someone else claimed it, not because it held memories untouched by loss, but because I was no longer standing at the doorway waiting for permission to belong. Healing did not arrive all at once. There were still evenings when I reached for my phone and stared at Daniel's name without pressing call. There were still holidays that felt thinner than they once had, but the space between those moments grew wider. In that space, routine settled. Tea at 4. Class on Tuesday. Walks in light rain. The sound of my own key turning in my front door each evening became reassuring instead of lonely. I began leaving small notes for myself on the kitchen table. Pay the electric bill. Buy apples. Ordinary reminders. Ordinary care. One evening, as I locked up the classroom after everyone had left, I paused with the cabinet key in my hand. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Chairs neatly pushed in. Whiteboard clean. I turned off the lights and stepped outside into the cool air. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel managed. I felt steady. And when I reached my own front door and slipped my key into the lock, I did not hesitate. I stepped inside and whispered softly into the quiet hallway, "I'm home." The bookkeeping class at the cafe did not remain small for long. Word travels quietly in neighborhoods like ours. Someone tells a sister. A neighbor mentions it at the bus stop. Within 3 months, we had to move the folding tables closer together to fit everyone. I did not advertise. I did not create flyers. I simply showed up every Tuesday with my notebook and a steady voice. That was enough at first. I told myself I was only filling time. But time, when treated gently, begins to fill you back. Miriam approached me one afternoon while drying cups behind the counter. "You know," she said carefully, "the community center 2 streets over is looking for someone to teach financial basics. Paid position. Very modest. But steady." Paid. The word sat differently in my ears than it once had. For years, money in my life had been something I managed for others. Something that moved outward. I had not needed income of my own since my husband passed. His pension and careful planning had kept me comfortable. My involvement in Daniel's finances had blurred the line between support and responsibility. I had not noticed how much of my identity was tied to being the quiet safety net. "I'll think about it," I told her. That night, I reviewed my own accounts carefully. For the first time in years, I examined them not as a mother planning transfers, but as a woman planning her own future. I saw stability. I saw enough. I saw room to grow if I chose to dot the following week. I visited the community center. The building was simple: beige walls, fluorescent lights, a bulletin board filled with handwritten notices about yoga classes and lost cats. The director, a soft-spoken man named Harold, asked me about my experience. I kept household accounts for many years, I said, and I've been teaching small workshops recently. He nodded. We need someone patient. I am patient, I replied. I began teaching there twice a week. The pay was modest, as Miriam promised, but it was mine. The first time the deposit appeared in my account, I stared at it longer than necessary. It was not the amount that moved me. It was the direction. The money had flowed toward me, earned through skill, not through obligation. My days developed structure. Mornings were for preparing lessons, afternoons at the cafe or community center, evenings quiet at home. I created simple worksheets, step-by-step guides. I taught people how to read loan terms carefully, how to build small emergency funds, how to say no to expenses that did not align with their values. One evening after class, a young woman lingered near the doorway. She held her notebook tightly against her chest. I've always felt stupid about money, she admitted softly. Like everyone else understands it but me. I recognized that tone. Not ignorance, shame. You are not stupid, I told her. You are simply not taught. There is a difference. She exhaled slowly, as if someone had lifted something invisible from her shoulders. In those moments, I saw my own past more clearly. I had not only been managing Daniel's accounts, I had been managing his uncertainty, filling gaps he did not yet know how to fill himself. I had mistaken that for closeness. At home, I began organizing my own finances with new intention. I consolidated small, scattered investments. I met with an advisor, not the one Daniel had chosen, but someone independent. I asked questions without embarrassment. I adjusted my will. I created a separate fund designated for community education grants. No dramatic declarations, just steady preparation. With each decision, I felt less like a background figure in someone else's story and more like the author of my own. The cafe classes expanded into Saturday workshops. Miriam rearranged tables without being asked. We created a small sign-in sheet. People brought friends. Sometimes they stayed afterward to talk about debt, about fear, about family members who promised things they could not afford. I listened more than I spoke. There was a pattern. I began to notice. Many people had tied love to financial rescue. Parents covering rent again and again. Adult children assuming support would always be available. Partners making promises before counting costs. I thought helping meant fixing everything. One man confessed during a session. It often means teaching, I replied gently. And sometimes teaching means stepping back. The word surprised even me. Financial independence grew quietly in my own life. I reduced unnecessary expenses. I began tracking my spending not out of anxiety, but awareness. I sold a piece of jewelry I had not worn in years and used the funds to purchase updated computer software for the classes. It felt purposeful, balanced. On my 62nd birthday, there was no candle waiting at the cafe this time. Instead, there was something different. After class at the community center, Harold handed me a small envelope. Inside was a certificate of appreciation from the board. Simple paper, black ink, for dedicated service and community impact. The room clapped softly. I felt my throat tighten, not from pride, but from recognition. I was being seen not as someone's mother, not as someone's financial backup, but as Eleanor. That evening, I walked home slowly. The sky was pale pink, the air cool, When I reached my front door and turned my key in the lock, I paused for a moment in the hallway. The house no longer felt like a place waiting for phone calls. It felt active. Papers on the desk, lesson plans on the table, my reading glasses resting beside an open book. Evidence of my own life unfolding. I brewed tea and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel once did his homework. The same table that had held untouched cups the night he returned my key. I placed both hands flat against the wood and breathed deeply. For years, I had measured my value by usefulness, by how quickly I responded, by how well I anticipated needs. When that role was removed, I mistook it for erasure, but sitting there, in the quiet of my own home, I understood something steady and undeniable. I was no longer trying to prove my worth. I was learning to live inside it. The realization did not come with fireworks. It came like sunrise, gradual, certain dot in the months that followed. I mentored 2 young women from the class who expressed interest in teaching others. I showed them how to create clear materials, how to speak slowly, how to hold silence without rushing to fill it. I paid them small stipends from the education fund I had created. Watching them stand at the front of the room felt different from watching Daniel promise something he could not yet afford. There was no anxiety in it, only growth that belonged to them. One afternoon, as I locked the classroom cabinet, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. My hair slightly grayer than before, my posture straighter. I realized I had stopped checking my phone for missed calls that were not coming. When Daniel's name finally did appear one evening, I did not feel panic. I did not feel anger. I felt prepared, not because I had rehearsed a speech, not because I wanted vindication, but because I knew the ground beneath me was solid. Independence is not loud. It does not announce itself with applause. It settles into your bones quietly, until standing alone no longer feels like falling, and by the time the past came knocking again, I was no longer standing at a doorway asking to be let in. I was already inside my own life. 10 years later, my phone rang on a Thursday afternoon while I was organizing folders for the fall session at the community center. The name on the screen was still saved the same way it had always been, Daniel. I looked at it for a long moment before answering. My hand did not tremble. My voice did not rush. "Hello," I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that carries years inside it. "Mom," he replied. His voice sounded older, thinner. "Hi." We exchanged a few careful sentences about health and weather, as if we were distant relatives reacquainting themselves at a formal gathering. Then he said, "I was hoping we could meet. There are some things we need to discuss." I agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. Not Miriam's cafe. This was neutral ground. When I arrived, they were already seated at a corner table. Marissa looked different, tired in a way that sleep does not fix. Daniel stood when he saw me, offering a brief, uncertain hug. "You look well," he said. "I am," I answered. We ordered coffee. Small talk circled the table but never settled. I noticed the absence of wedding rings on both their hands, though no explanation was offered at first. Eventually, Daniel cleared his throat. "Things have been complicated." He glanced at Marissa before continuing. "The business didn't recover after the market shifted. We tried restructuring again, but the debt stacked up faster than we expected." Restructuring. The word had aged poorly. Marissa folded her hands neatly on the table. "We've sold the apartment," she said quietly. "And we're finalizing the divorce." The word landed softly without drama. Divorce. They did not look at each other when it was spoken. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "We were wondering if we could stay with you for a while, just until we get back on our feet." There it was. Not an apology. not acknowledgement of distance, a request. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream blend into brown. For how long? I asked. A few months, Daniel said quickly. Maybe less. Marissa added it would help stabilize things. Show creditors we have support. Support. I heard the careful phrasing. This was not only about housing. It was about reputation, about appearing steady to the outside world. We know we've been distant, Daniel continued, but family is family. He said it gently, as if reminding me of a shared rule. I looked at him fully then. His face still carried the boy I once drove to school, but he was no longer that boy. He was a man asking to step back into a space he had once closed. Family is presence, I said quietly, not convenience. Neither of them responded immediately. I did not raise my voice. I did not recount the letter. I did not describe the hallway or the returned key. There was no need. The years had already done that work inside me. Daniel exhaled slowly. We thought maybe enough time had passed. Time had passed. It had shaped me into someone who no longer mistook rescue for love. I care about you, I said steadily. Both of you. But my home is not an emergency solution. Marissa's expression tightened slightly, though she remained composed. We wouldn't want to be a burden, she said. I almost smiled at the word. Burden had once been something I carried willingly without naming. I believe you, I replied. And that's why I'm saying no. The silence that followed was different from the silence 10 years earlier. That one had been filled with my fear of losing them. This one was filled with clarity. Daniel shifted in his seat. We thought you'd understand. I do understand, I said gently. I understand what it means to build your own foundation. I understand what it costs to rely on someone who may not always be there. He looked at the table. Marissa reached for her cup but did not drink. I reached into my bag and removed a small envelope. Inside was a list of financial counseling services and short-term rental agencies. Practical resources? Not money. Not keys. These are solid options, I explained. People I trust. Daniel glanced at the envelope but did not open it. So that's it? He asked softly. I nodded. That's it. There was no anger in my chest. No bitterness. Only a steady boundary. We didn't mean to hurt you back then, Daniel said after a moment. It was not an apology. It was a revision. I know, I answered. And I did know. They had not acted out of cruelty. They had acted out of immaturity and fear of dependence. I stood slowly, placing a few bills on the table for my coffee. I hope you both find stability, I said. Truly. Daniel looked up at me, something unspoken behind his eyes. Mom, he began, but the sentence did not finish. I placed my hand briefly on his shoulder. The gesture surprised him. It surprised me too. You are capable, I told him. More than you think, but capability grows when you carry your own weight. Marissa's eyes softened slightly, though pride kept her posture straight. Thank you for meeting us, she said. Of course, I replied. I picked up my coat and walked toward the door. The bell above it chimed lightly as I stepped outside. The air was cool, steady. I did not look back immediately. When I did, through the glass, I saw them sitting quietly across from one another. No anger, no raised voices. Just two adults facing consequences that were not dramatic, only real. I turned and began walking down the sidewalk. Each step felt grounded. 10 years earlier, I had stood in a hallway holding a key that no longer opened the door. Now, I carried my own keys in my pocket, and every door they opened belonged to me. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. I felt aligned. The power shift was not in denying them. It was in not abandoning myself to accommodate them. As I reached the corner, I paused briefly, letting the moment settle fully inside me. Then I continued home, steady and unhurried, leaving the past seated at a table where it could finally learn to stand on its own dot in the months after our meeting at the coffee shop. I did not hear from Daniel or Marissa often. There were no angry messages, no dramatic accusations, just distance again, though this time it felt different. It no longer carried the sharp edge of rejection. It felt like space where responsibility was finally being sorted properly. Through a mutual acquaintance from the old neighborhood, I learned that Daniel had taken a position with a mid-sized accounting firm. Not as a partner, not as an owner, as an employee. The salary was steady but modest compared to what he once aimed for. I imagined him sitting at a desk under fluorescent lights, reviewing spreadsheets that did not belong to him. There was humility in that image, not humiliation, just recalibration. A year later, he sent me a short email. No greeting beyond my name. I'm learning more working for someone than I ever did trying to lead too quickly, he wrote. It's not glamorous, but it's stable. Stable. I sat with that word for a while. Stability had once been something I provided quietly in the background of his life. Now he was beginning to build it himself. It was not dramatic growth. It was incremental, the kind that lasts. Marissa moved to a smaller apartment across town after the divorce finalized. I heard she found work managing operations for a retail company. Structured hours, clear expectations, no speculation, no risk-heavy promises. When I saw her once by chance at a grocery store, she looked surprised but not uncomfortable. Eleanor, she said softly. We stood near the produce section. Two women who had once shared a fragile version of family. I hope you're well, I told her. I am, she replied. There was a pause before she added, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About presence. I nodded gently. There was no need to revisit it. I think we were afraid of needing anyone, she continued. So we pushed away the person who knew how to help. It was not an apology, but it was honest. I hope you find the balance, I said. And I meant it. We parted without tension. Daniel did not remarry quickly. In fact, he did not remarry at all, at least not in the years that followed. He rented a modest apartment and, according to the brief updates I received, kept his life simple. No extravagant ventures, no grand declarations. Just work, savings, and quiet routine. One December evening, he called unexpectedly. I paid off the last of the business debt today, he said. His voice held a quiet pride. Took longer than I thought. I'm glad, I answered. I didn't ask you for help, he added, almost carefully. I know, I said. There was something steady in that exchange. A mutual understanding that assistance offered too easily can sometimes delay growth. I did not remind him of the past. I did not say I was proud. I allowed the accomplishment to stand on its own. Marissa eventually began volunteering with a local women's resource center. I learned this through Miriam, who kept her ear close to community news. She's good with organizing events, Miriam mentioned casually one afternoon. Seems very focused. I felt a quiet sense of respect at that. Marissa had always valued structure and control. Channeling that into service rather than image felt like progress. Their lives did not collapse after I said no. They did not lose everything. They did not become cautionary tales. They adjusted. They recalculated. They faced the natural weight of choices made in youth and carried them forward with more maturity than before. As for me, my work at the community center expanded gradually. 2 of my former students began leading sessions independently. The education fund I established supported 3 small scholarships for adults, returning to school for financial literacy certification. It was not a large program, but it was steady. Daniel visited once, about 3 years after our coffee shop conversation. He did not ask to move in. He did not hint at financial trouble. He simply came for tea. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one that had held so many unspoken things. I didn't understand what you were building for yourself, he admitted quietly. I was building it for a long time, I replied. You just couldn't see it yet. He nodded. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tears across the table. Just two adults sharing space without negotiation. Natural consequences rarely announce themselves loudly. They unfold in routines, in smaller apartments, in slower promotions, in humility learned through experience rather than lecture. Daniel learned to measure risk more carefully. Marissa learned that independence without connection can become isolation. And I learned that love offered without boundaries can become self-erasure. None of us were destroyed by what happened. We were reshaped. I did not celebrate their struggles. I did not interpret their setbacks as punishment. Life simply balanced itself the way it often does, when no one interferes to soften every fall. On quiet evenings, when rain touches my windows the way it did years ago in that small cafe, I sometimes think about the hallway where I once stood holding a returned key. I no longer feel the sting of it. I see it now as a turning point for all of us. They needed to learn how to stand without leaning, and I needed to learn that standing firm does not mean standing alone. There are evenings now when my house is very quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, the kind that once sounded like absence. I move through the room slowly, turning off lamps one by one, straightening papers on my desk, rinsing a single teacup in the sink. The rhythm is familiar, intentional. Nothing in this home feels temporary anymore. The hallway no longer echoes. The coat hanging by the door belongs to me. The spare key on the small wooden dish is not waiting for someone who may or may not return it. It is simply there, part of a life that is steady and self-contained. Daniel and I speak now in ways that feel balanced. Not daily, not urgently. Sometimes we share a meal. Sometimes we go weeks without contact. There is no tension in the silence anymore. When he sits at my kitchen table, he does so as a guest who understands the weight of that word. And I offer tea not out of obligation, but because I want to. Marissa sends a holiday card each year. The messages are brief but thoughtful. She signs her name carefully. I place the cards on the mantle with the others, not as symbols of what was lost, but as markers of what has matured. Time did not restore everything to what it once was. It did something better. It removed the illusion that love must always mean rescue. I used to believe that family was proven through sacrifice, through giving without limit, through anticipating needs before they were spoken. I believed that if I stayed useful, I would stay close, but usefulness is not the same as belonging. Belonging is built through presence, through consistency, through choosing to remain even when nothing is being offered in return. The people who sit in my financial classes now are not related to me by blood. Yet when they return week after week, when they trust me with their confusion and small victories, there is something deeply familial in that exchange. Not because I save them, not because they depend on me, but because we show up for one another without bargaining. I think about the woman I was the day I walked into the bank and closed my accounts. She believed she was losing something essential. She believed that stepping back meant becoming irrelevant. She did not understand yet was that sometimes stepping back is the only way to see yourself clearly. There is a photograph on my bookshelf of Daniel as a child, standing beside his father in the backyard. They are both smiling, sunlight caught in their hair. For years, that image made me ache. It reminded me of what felt broken. Now, when I look at it, I feel something softer. We were never meant to carry each other forever. We were meant to learn. to separate, to return in different shapes. Family is not the house you hold open at all costs. It is the door you keep unlocked for those who knock with respect. And as I turn off the final light each night and walk down the quiet hallway toward my bedroom, I do so without waiting for footsteps behind me. I am not abandoned. I am not needed. I am simply here, and that is enough.